Hi to anyone who has just joined the webinar. We'll just give it another minute or so to allow the other guests to join, and then we'll get started. So, hello, my name is Sarah Ray, and I'm an editor at Global Government Forum. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're discussing flexible and hybrid working, particularly in the context of its impact on the careers of female public servants. We have some great guests with us today who I'll introduce soon, and they're going to be talking us through this important topic. So, as we know, the pandemic prompted a shift to remote and hybrid working like never before, included in the public sector. And remote, flexible, and hybrid working are now much more common than they were previously. Research last year found that hybrid working has encouraged more professional women to move to full-time work and enabled many to better balance work and other responsibilities. We also know that it's not a silver bullet. Some governments and private sector firms are enforcing returns to the office or refusing flexible working requests, and questions remain about how hybrid working could impact women's careers. Additionally, managing hybrid workforces may require some adjustments, such as making sure everyone gets visibility, thinking about how to communicate differently remotely, and the need to support the careers of people who work part-time or have caring responsibilities. So these are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at today. And I'm happy to be joined by some great speakers who will share their thoughts in a moment. After the opening presentations, we'll take some questions from the audience. So please do send yours in via the Q&A on the console, and we will get to as many of those as we can. So today I'm happy to be joined by Natasha Jamal, who is the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Accessibility at the United States Digital Service. In this role, she's focused on removing barriers for underrepresented technologists to enable them to thrive in the workplace. And prior to her experience in government, Natasha served as a subject matter expert on culture at Gallup, where she established the culture transformation practice and helped organisations get clear on defining behaviours related to organisational values. Thanks for joining us, Natasha. We also have Kumbi Kariwo, who is Health Inequalities Lead at Birmingham Community Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust here in the UK. Kumbi is a registered learning disability nurse with a 22-year career in the NHS. In 2016, Kumbi's pioneering efforts led to the establishment of the Young People's Sexual Health Service, which was recognised by MP Jess Phillips and commended by the Care Quality Commission for its impact in addressing inequalities in Birmingham. Kumbi is also the chair of the Midlands Digital Shared Decision-Making Council for Nurses, Midwives and Allied Health Professionals, the Midlands representative at the National Digital Shared Decision-Making Council, and a member of the Queen's Nursing Institute Research Forum. So welcome, Kumbi. And we also have Yadira Guerrero, who is the Chief for Enterprise Human Capital Initiatives at the US Small Business Administration. She previously served as the Chief Learning Officer and Director of Talent Management and Development Services at the US Office of Personnel Management. And she's also currently a student in the Virginia Commonwealth University Doctor of Education program in General Leadership, centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to begin with, I'm going to ask the speakers to share their experiences and thoughts on today's topic, hybrid working as it relates to the careers of female public servants. And Natasha, welcome to the webinar, and can we please start with you?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. You mentioned that I work at the United States Digital Service, and we are involved in anything that you may see on the news, whether it's about healthcare, whether it's about food assistance, whether it's about retirement, taxes, working behind the scenes on that. And before that, I worked at Gallup, where we were very big on looking at the data. So I am going to start by sharing a little bit of data and then getting into the more personal and how it's applied to some of my experience. So looking at some of the data, hybrid by some of the numbers, these are just a few stats that I think are really compelling and telling for how hybrid work really affects women specifically. So one thing that we have seen is that 3 million women have left the workforce. 3 million American women have left the workforce since the start of the pandemic. And a lot of that is due to the disproportionate burden that they have in terms of childcare and elder care. 75% of women reported a better work-life balance thanks to hybrid working. This number is also high for people in general, but very high for women. So better work-life balance, able to do the responsibilities of the job, but also do other things that make us human. We have lives outside of our jobs, and this helps with that. And then one of the things that I want to mention also is that even in heterosexual relationships where both partners work full time, women still spend 40% more time caregiving than their male partner. And that is both for caregiving for children, for older adults or parents, and women tend to be caregivers for multiple people at a time. So we see this on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, and then also overall. So want to just lay out some of these stats to help ground us in some of the unique challenges and some of the unique opportunities that hybrid poses for women. I also want to talk a little bit just about what this has meant in my personal experience. So the U.S. Digital Service, we work specifically on the technology that enables government services, and we work specifically in my role on helping underrepresented technologists thrive in the workforce. We realized during COVID that while we could not work side by side with agencies in terms of physical proximity, we were actually able to hire technologists from all over the country for the first time, which meant that people didn't have to live in Washington, D.C., which is one of the most expensive places to live in the US. It also meant that some of our employees that did live in Washington, D.C., but had an hour or an hour and a half commute every day into the office didn't have to spend that time commuting every single day. We also really learned that, great technologists are everywhere in our country. A lot of people cannot come into an office every day, but that doesn't make them any less good at their job. We have seen some improvements in terms of well-being, in terms of having a more diverse workforce, and in terms of a higher percentage of employees who identify as female and disabled since offering hybrid work. So we've actually been able to track some of that data from pre-2020 to now and know that some of those are because of hybrid. I'm part of a parents and caregivers group at the US Digital Service and get to talk all the time to amazing engineers, product managers, and designers who are here and said they could never be here. They could never be working in this job if the hybrid and remote options were not offered. So really thinking about how do we create a workforce that works for all people? And for us, that is critically important because we serve all people. So how do we really have that reflection in our workforce? And then for me personally, I am a mom of 2 young children. I also have some care for my parents. And the ability for me, and I live about an hour away from work. So that means 2 hours of commute every single day. I do go into the office certain days, but I use my time really intentionally on the days that I go in. I use it for brainstorming, to work on really challenging problems, to build relationships with people. And other days, I use my time at home. And sometimes there are these thoughts that, we don't work as much at home. I will say that on days that I am home, I actually have, usually an hour and a half or 2 hours more of a work day that I can use in very different ways and use to get some of the deep work done that I need to without certain interruptions, without having to look for an office space to crawl into. We don't have our own offices. So also making sure that, you have a space to take a call. And if there are other things going on in the day, to actually be able to go to different events, to assist with childcare duties, and still get all of that work done. So just want to say that, the high level stats are there, and there have been all of these studies done. But we have also seen this really specifically in our own workforce, and studied it at a more micro level to see the change over the years. So, really looking forward to talking more about some of these opportunities. And then we'll make sure also as we go into the panel to talk about some of the challenges and how we've thought about that as well. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It was great to get those context setting statistic from you, particularly that 75%, which is a really interesting finding. And then also great to get your experience from the US Digital Service and your personal reflection. So we'll definitely pick up more on some of the points that you've raised in the later discussion. So before we go into the next presentations, just want to remind the audience to send your own thoughts and questions in so that we can pick those up later in the webinar. So Kumbi, if we could come to you next, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as we know today, we're talking about the impact of moving to flexible and hybrid working. Next slide, please. So for us, I think, as Sarah said, the pandemic, so COVID-19 was an opportunity for a real shift for us. And what it did for us in England is that it accelerated the adoption of flexible and hybrid working models. I think prior to that, it was very much an in-person model that we utilized. And I think conversations about shifting, to a hybrid model, I think usually stunted. I think it didn't go much further because I think we didn't know any different. So I think the pandemic, whilst it was devastating, I think what it did is that it did us a favor in starting to address some of the conversations that we previously, I think, had classed as too hard to do. And so I think we're still developing the model. And I think over time, I hope it gets better. And I think so far, it already has improved lives. And I think there's still more room for improvement. Next slide. So for me, in terms of looking at it from a positive a viewpoint, as Natasha said, work-life balance. By being able to work flexibly, I think one of the things, particularly as women and as women who are carers, women who might be single parents, the ability to be in person some of the time, and actually at home to look after your family, tend to your home life, has meant that people have the ability and the confidence to hold careers and hold roles, strategic roles particularly, that they might not have otherwise have thought to apply for. Because what you tend to hear is women tend to prioritize their home life, ensure that that is stable before they pursue their careers. So I think what this is allowing is for women to readdress and rebalance some of the work strategical roles that we've seen. And I think as well, it's quite important to acknowledge that if we don't have women who are in strategic roles, policies will always be written in a way that might not suit women that are working, in these organizations. So for example, for us, the NHS, we have an 85% ratio. So where women are, so 85% of our workforce are women. So if you have, and when you look at the representation of our senior management, it's not reflective of our workforce. So you do have to start to ask the question, is what's being deployed suitable for the workforce if the senior management is not reflective of that? As an organization, we've also started to focus on neurodivergent individuals. Some of our offices are open plan, and actually, that environment is not always suitable if you're someone who's neurodivergent. And it's actually by being able to work from home, what you are allowing is for that individual to be able to create an environment that supports them in addressing some of their sensory overload. And so you can have a balance of in-person and remote working, which enables individuals to work more productively. Collaboration, I think Natasha said this before, is that whilst previously you might have only applied for jobs locally, flexible working, remote working has actually enabled talent to start applying for roles across the country. So you now have skill set, different mindset, different thinking in environments we previously might not have had. And talent attraction, I think when an organization has flexible policies, flexible ways of working, that is a recruitment drive for people because they know that they're able to balance their work and home life, and they probably end up giving more towards their organization because that flexibility is in place. Next slide, please. So what are the disadvantages? So what we know is that single women and carers tend to face the greatest challenges. And we know that sometimes they've been looked past for promotions because they've had to pretty much prioritize their home life. So how are we ensuring that actually we're balancing some of the inequity that we know that's present? Visibility, sometimes we know it's that person who's the talker, who's in the office, who's networking, and yet you've got very diligent, very capable people who might be working from home who get overlooked. So how are we looking at ensuring that trying to balance your home and work life situation doesn't disadvantage you, particularly if you can show through your results that you're very much a capable and competent person. Career development, so things such as training, mentorship, again, like I said, mentoring. Some people thrive in certain environments, and I guess for us, how are we being more inclusive and ensuring that different environments are equitable? I think for us, the hybrid working has probably started to introduce inequalities we might not have thought about. And so how are we ensuring that our policies and the way we go forward doesn't eliminate people that have potential? And then unconscious bias. I think the reason why we hadn't previously moved to this model is that there's always the thinking that actually when you're home, out of sight, out of mind, what are you doing? But as Natasha said, I think most people end up doing more to compensate for the fact that they're not being seen. So actually, how do we start to readdress some of the mindset and some of the thinking of our culture? Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that we need to start to look at is leadership support. So how are our managers, our line managers championing flexible working? I know sometimes this can be utilized to make one's work life a really good situation, or sometimes it can be used to disadvantage that individual even more so. So how are we ensuring that our leaders understand the impact that when staff are happy, it means productivity and it means great development for the organization? Inclusive policies. So what we're learning is our policies were developed with one mindset. And as we're starting to apply things such as the Equality Act 2010 that we have here in England, what we're seeing is that sometimes our policies have not always been written with an inclusive lens. And so when we look at our staff, so if we look at the 9 protected characteristics that we have from gender, race to disability, amongst the other characteristics, how are we ensuring that we haven't disadvantaged people through the policies that we write? And then career development. I think everyone has their own personal targets and their own personal goals. Some people will say to you, you know, being a mom and family is important for me. If I can get my, you know, work to balance that, that's brilliant. Other people are driven, you know, women want to be the CEO. And actually, how are we ensuring that the environment suits the women that want to be a CEO and a mom? So I think it's how we, you know, start to change the narrative. And I think at this point, it's important to acknowledge it's Black History Month here in England. And so, as a Black woman, for me, how are we changing the narrative? Because I know the rule book hasn't necessarily been written for me. And so, how are we ensuring that in the environments that we're creating, someone like me can still be visible, still progress, and still achieve the outcomes, you know, that I've set out to achieve? Next slide, please. So I'll leave the talk on, you know, this PowerPoint, which is, for me, policies are important. They enable us to bring in change where sometimes the system and the systemic structure is preventing it. So for example, in England, we now have a flexible working policy. What this allows is for members who work in the NHS to have guidance that allows them to have a conversation with their manager to address how they can balance their work, have a work-life balance. So for example, you can ask for a 9-day fortnight. So this is where you have compressed hours. We have carers leave. So you get 3 days if the person that you care for is unwell or you need to attend medical appointments. We have flexible leave in place. And so the policies allow our staff members to be able to have that protected time to be caregivers. We also have networks. I believe knowledge is power. And so by actually articulating what your issue is, that's how we begin to address it. So these are the, as you can see on the screen, our 5 networks. So we have the Women's Equalities Network, the LGBT plus allies network, Disability and Neurodiversity Network, Cultural Diverse Staff Network, and the Carers Network. We appreciate that there might be some intersectionality in our networks, but what we're saying is we recognize that sometimes there's a disadvantage there, and actually, what are we doing to proactively address it? So I'll hand over back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. That's brilliant, and definitely recognise what you said around the pandemic forcing us to try a new way of working. And great to hear about, you know, your insights on it opening roles to people that might not have tried them before, and as a talent attraction strategy. And later on, we're definitely going to look at some of those practical areas that you mentioned. So thank you very much for that. And Yadira, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. So at the Small Business Administration, our mission is to help the American people start and grow small businesses. We also have a disaster response function. So right now, for example, with the Hurricane Helene that came through the United States, our team is down there on the ground helping those citizens get back up and running. For us at the SBA, the pandemic allowed us to extend our definition of workforce flexibilities. We were already participating in telework, so we already had that hybrid work model where employees could report on site a few days and report work from their home, typically a few days out of the work week. So what I'm going to go through today is kind of those new policies that were implemented as a result of the pandemic, because we identified additional needs that were not being met for the workforce, but also the pandemic being one of the biggest, the biggest telework pilot that we all participated in really also offered a lens as to those life responsibilities that employees had to manage. It was, for all of us, a new situation, right? It wasn't your typical type of telework. So it did highlight some of those opportunities to do better. For us, we define workforce flexibilities as a strategic workforce tools that provide our employees autonomy and choices to meet both our mission needs and also for them while they're managing their work and life responsibilities. It is truly a co-creation between the supervisor and the employees regarding these 3 different questions. Where is the employee working from? So at the SBA, we do offer telework or hybrid work, like I've mentioned. In fact, even in 2023, as we've seen more transition back to the workplace, and we've seen a decrease in government. I think now it's at 34%. At the SBA, we've continued to increase our numbers of telework, where more than 80% of our workforce participates in this work model. We've also leveraged remote work, which is a flexibility in which there's no expectation for the employee to report to an official SBA facility. We've really strategically leveraged this for our disaster response. It's like Kumbi mentioned, Natasha mentioned, it allows us to tap a wider talent pool. And if there's no expectation for that employee to report on site, we're able to recruit more broadly and also get them on board more efficiently when we're trying to respond to ensure that we're there for any of those disaster survivors and victims. Additionally, we offer the flexibility for employees to request temporary exceptions to reporting to their official work site. So this is really key because even though we have the hybrid model where a few days out of the work week, you don't have to be on site, the temporary exception, I think, really gives you for those needs that come up, family emergency needs, et cetera, where you don't have to come on site. All of that, like I've mentioned, it's that co-creation with the employee and the supervisor. Now, the other factor that we look at as well is when the employee is able to work. So at the SBA, we were able to expand the number of flexible work schedules. So really giving employees more autonomy to choose, do I want to work 4 10-hour days? Do I still want to continue to work that typical 8-hour day? All based on what their needs are. And then we also implemented a midday flex. This gives employees the opportunity to leave, arrive, or depart their work site during their lunchtime. So for example, today, I'm going to exercise that option. I started my day working from home, but during my lunchtime, I'm going to go ahead and commute into the office because I have an in-person engagement that requires me to be physically there in person. We also have gliding start and end time. So the employee can choose when they want to start their days within certain parameters. During that pandemic, what we noticed is some employees had a need to start their days earlier. So they can start as early as 5 o'clock in the morning, but they can also start as late as 10 o'clock in the morning. And the 10 o'clock in the morning really gives them the opportunity to avoid that commute. So even though typically my commute might be an hour during those heavy traffic times, if I leave closer to 9:30, it could be reduced by a few more minutes. So still giving them back some of that time. And then we also implemented health and wellness breaks. This is where employees are able to take 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes during their workday to focus on those health and wellness goals that they have. They are required to make up the time, but it still gives them that opportunity to integrate the health piece within their workday and not have to, create those different segments during their workday. So and then the other aspect, so how do we get to where and when? It's the what, right? Like what type of work are you working on that requires either your physical presence in the office or something that could be done virtually from the convenience of your home? A lot of this will be made, these decisions will be made based on the type of work, your job responsibilities, and your job duties. So really focus around team-based projects. If I'm kicking off a new team project, most likely I will be facilitating that in person. One other key thing I wanted to mention about the SBA is that we do, even prior to the pandemic, we had a geographically dispersed workforce throughout the United States. So we had already been using these virtual collaboration tools. What the pandemic did was really, I think to what Kumbi mentioned, accelerated the type of technology. And we had to get out of our comfort zones to really be intentional around using specific technology to improve that virtual collaboration that was already happening, but there was a difference between, okay, everybody call in, use the Polycom versus like now we're all on video, we can still see one another. So for team-based projects, most likely I would facilitate in person, and depending on who's invited, if we have individuals not located here within the Washington, D.C. area, we would offer that hybrid option. It was already part of our culture. And then individual contributors. So if I'm really focused on researching, writing a policy, et cetera, that's probably work that I would do when I'm working from home. Today's presentation, same thing. To avoid those office distractions, I prefer to let me conduct the presentation here from my home. Everyone else is not here. They're either at school or work. So it really gives me more autonomy to show up and be my best self for the presentation. And then agency engagement. So we've always offered that hybrid option for participation. But when we do have whether our administrators out visiting employees in a field location, we try to broadcast live from those locations. So any employees that are there on site, highly encouraged to attend in person, and vice versa. When we have events at headquarters, we're highly encouraged to attend in person, which is really that opportunity to connect with colleagues that you might not have seen in some time. And it is, I think that's one of the challenges that we continue to grapple with, is how is it really feasible to replicate that in-person connection interaction that you get in a virtual space? Even with the technology, we continue to look further at opportunities to really enhance that experience. From a personal reflections perspective, I've been in public service for over 10 years, and I've always had flexibilities that were available for me to use. So just lessons that I've learned with leveraging these workplace flexibilities, because I do approach a lot of my decisions around what's within my control. So what's been key for me has really been being an advocate for myself. And that does require a psychologically safe workplace where I can have the conversations with my supervisor to say, hey, I've got this childcare need, and I really would appreciate it if I could, leave work a little earlier so that I could be there, or I need to come in later to drop my child off at school. Those different things require you to be vulnerable and share what are those life needs that you're trying to manage. And I will say initially, it was difficult to have those conversations, but as I built that trust with my supervisor, and even my current supervisor, it's become much easier to just be like, hey, this is what's going on. What can we do? So it goes back to co-creating those options for yourself. The other piece of this too is the ability, and I think Natasha, you touched on this already, being intentional with how you're designing your workday. So you know best what responsibilities you have. You know best what your career aspirations are. So trying to figure out how can you leverage these flexibilities to help you meet these goals. As was previously mentioned, I'm currently a doctoral student. So there are times when I have that conversation with my supervisor that I have to either leave early, so using either the midday flex or starting earlier so that I can leave on time to make it to class on time. And that's all because I have this other goal I'm working on while I'm still trying to ensure that I'm performing optimally in the workplace. And the other key thing that we've mentioned, I think we've heard throughout all of our presentations, is the communication. But it's not just the frequency, it's truly the quality of those communications. So how are you truly conveying what your needs are, and then working with your supervisor to help you best identify those flexibilities that you can use. So I think we're going to go ahead and jump into the conversations around some of the other aspects of flexibilities and hybrid work. So I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Great to hear about how you do things at the SBA and also your own personal reflections on this topic. So you've all alluded to some of the the positives that this can bring and also the challenges. So I wanted to look just a little bit more about the challenges and understand which ones you've all observed, both personally and from an organisational perspective. You know, maybe some teething troubles with hybrid working or some challenges that you've had to overcome. So Natasha, if we could start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pick up on one that Kumbi mentioned about bias. So proximity bias is this tendency for people to show kind of favoritism or preferential treatment to people who are close to them physically. That is a very real thing. And that is something that I think every workplace that has gone from a situation where you were mostly in person to a situation where you are less in person than you used to be faces that in some way. I think being really aware that, first of all, calling it out, right? That exists and that is a natural tendency for all of us. We see this at both like a macro level of who gets chosen to do certain assignments, who gets picked first for, different events. But we also see it on a day-to-day level. And I think the day-to-day level is actually a really good place to start. So one example I can give is if you think about a meeting where some of the people are sitting in a conference room in person and some people are on screens, the tendency is to have a little bit of a side conversation or more conversation with the people in the room. And I have experienced this when I have been virtual. I imagine others have experienced when they've been virtual, like they feel like they're missing part of the conversation. So there are some things, that you can think about doing, in that case. You can do things like have everyone join from a video screen to make sure that, like everyone is kind of like one screen, one person, and we're talking in that way. You can also, some places, what they do is they actually focus more on the people who are not in the room and say, we're going to start with someone who is on the screen to talk about this. So we see a lot with proximity bias, both on the macro level in terms of, anything from like even a promotion or job assignment to like the micro level of day-to-day decision making. A few other areas that I think are really, really challenging with hybrid, I think the building relationships and the speed to building relationships can be hard because some of those it's harder to have some of the casual conversations, and I think relationships are often built through casual and informal conversations, and technology can make things really formal. So some of the things that I've seen for that are actually having some of these asynchronous channels, whether you use Slack or Teams or something else, actually having more social channels where people can talk about different types of things outside of work, hobbies. We have lots of these channels. We have channels about cats and dogs and lots of different types of things to build relationships. And then actually scheduling like coffee chats that are less about the work and all of those things and learning about the individual. So, proximity bias, building relationships. I think Kumbi also mentioned that mentoring and coaching can look really different in this environment. So it can be harder. And when we think about how much like mentorship and sponsorship affects women's careers specifically, mentorship and sponsorship often looks different in a virtual environment. So figuring out, first of all, how do you find that mentor and sponsor? How do you build that relationship with them? How do you think about having some of those coffee chats, whether it's virtual or figuring out the right time to go in person? I think that's really hard. I think managers sometimes also have a hard time because they don't know how to build the relationships or have all of the conversations. So providing managers with even some questions you can ask to get to know your team members when you may not have an in-person team retreat or those casual conversations. And then one other thing that I'll talk about is conflict is often harder to resolve. So sometimes it is harder to read someone's body language in a meeting and to know, oh, is that person upset that I said that thing? Or did I say the wrong thing? And then to know how big of an issue something is, but then also to figure out how you resolve that. Now, when conflict comes up in person, sometimes you're able to say, hey, can we go grab coffee? Or I just wanted to see how that meeting went. Can we just, do a sidebar on that? In the virtual environment, it can be really difficult, and in a hybrid environment, when sometimes you're coming in, sometimes you're not, it can be really difficult to know, how do I address those things and how big of a deal was that? So reading the body language and finding different ways to have some of those interpersonal types of conversations in this varied environment. So I will leave it at that for now, and have the other panelists weigh in, but I think there are certainly some challenges, and I think, we can also think about different ways to mitigate them. I would say none of these challenges mean that we should not have hybrid work. It just means, we need to think about, how do we adjust to this? How do we be more intentional, as I think both of the other panelists have mentioned? Because I think sometimes people want to say, oh, well, this is all harder because of hybrid. And I'd say this is all harder because we haven't put the right intention around it yet, or we haven't figured it out yet. And so I wouldn't want to use any of these challenges as an excuse not to offer hybrid work.
Definitely. Kumbi, do you recognize any of those challenges you want to pick up on, or any others that you would like to raise, and perhaps ways that you might address them?
Thank you. Yes, very well covered by Natasha. So you've made my life a lot easier. So yes, just to say, for us, and particularly my role, we look at digital poverty. We automatically assume that people have got the means to communicate remotely. So things like having access to the internet. Some people might not be able to afford to have, the right equipment and setup at home. So those are some of the challenges that we need to address. And also, I guess, when you look at it as a generational situation. So when I was growing up in school, we started accessing computers. So I feel relatively comfortable using a laptop, logging on to Teams or Zoom. But actually, that's already a barrier for some people. And also for us, we're quite a diverse nation. And so we're also looking at things such as language barriers. So actually, when you're asking people to use online platforms, again, is there an exclusion there? And just because someone is employed, it doesn't mean to say that that has overcome their barrier. Even the way we set up systems, some of our colleagues are able to access some of our systems via VPN. Others, because they might not have a trust device because of the nature of their role, they might not be able to access internal information. So I guess, how are we proactively thinking of those that we're excluding by heading towards a digital or a hybrid way of working? I think, as Natasha said, it's overcome quite a lot of challenges. So let's not be put off by the presenting challenges. They're just new challenges that we need to look at how we can address these. I think the other challenge I would look at is that sometimes some of the policies are set at a national level, and it's how are you then applying them at a local level. I can look at my situation. So my team manager is very flexible. He's very much, someone who allows us to work autonomously and is very solution and strength based. So that drastically, influences how I can work in a hybrid way, how I contribute. I know, speaking, to individuals across the country, not everyone, is as lucky. And so, what are the challenges that are being brought in, I guess, because of culture and mindset? Because sometimes what we find is that people are comfortable with what they know. And when you start to introduce something new with uncertainties, sometimes the risk appetite isn't there, but actually, are we disadvantaging ourselves by saying it's too complex or sat in the too hard to do, when actually there might be quite an easy or a quick fix to addressing, that challenge, So I think it's about understanding the pain point, if I can call it that, and being solution based in how we can move forwards, because I think it's already been seen, particularly for women, and particularly for women that care, that this has allowed them to actually, increase their ability to be involved in, improving their work status. So yes, so I think, we're on the right track.
Brilliant, thank you. And Yadira, how about challenges that you've observed, or how you think about this proximity bias issue, or different communication styles?
Yeah, from my perspective, like it's already been mentioned, I feel these are not necessarily new challenges, rather it's the new environment, right? When we talk about distractions in the office, it's people just walking in, saying good morning, and that leads to like a 30-minute conversation. Online, it's wow, okay, I have people sending me messages via chat. I have people trying to call me, or while we're in a meeting, there's still those sidebar conversations happening, right, via chat. So I think it's the environment is different. The challenges are still the same, but it does require us to take different approaches to address them. And then the other piece I wanted to contribute was how these challenges could differ depending on you as the employee and where you're at in your career. For me personally, when I first started in a supervisory position, I had the flexibility to telework, but I chose to go in the office 5 days a week for those first 90 days, because my goal at that time was really to start building the relationships, learning the organizational culture, and creating team cohesion. I did not have those expectations for my employees, and that goes back to where I was at within my career, and also the goals that I had to be successful in that position. And I think what we've seen with a lot of the research around hybrid work as well, for like newer employees, it may be best if they're working on site regularly for those first few months, so that they also get that sense of culture, opportunities to build relationships. But if you've been at the organization for years, you've already, have established relationships. You know who to connect with, about the organizational culture. So your challenges may look different. If anything, it could be like, wow, how do I leverage this technology now to continue to sustain those connections? So those were the two things I wanted to contribute.
Brilliant, thank you. So we are getting some questions in now, so we will take some of those. And we've had a few in about the sort of boomerang effect that we're seeing now. A lot of places introduced more remote, hybrid and flexible working in the pandemic. Now we're seeing more headlines about return to office mandates, fewer opportunities in this area. So I wonder if the panelists have any thoughts on why this might be. And often these mandates are set from the top. So how can a sort of junior member of staff challenge them? Anyone like to start? Kumbi, I'll go with you.
Thank you. So I think in terms of returning to the office, I think some of the things that Natasha and Yadira were saying about the in-person contact, that blue sky thinking, I think is harder to do remotely. And I think probably businesses are starting to see how that impact is having an influence. And again, like I said, you tend to go to what you know works. So I do wonder if there's a drive, because there's certain aspects where there isn't that level of productivity that they know can only happen in a face-to-face environment. But that's not to say that some of the aspects cannot be done remotely. I think from, a nation's context around income, so from a national perspective, for me to move from my home into my office, I drive, so I'm probably putting fuel in my car. When I'm at the office, I probably go to the local, sandwich bar, so I'm purchasing from a business. I'll probably, be stressed and have an impulse buy on my way home, get a dress to make myself feel good. And I might call one of my girlfriends and say, let's go to the wine bar. I'll leave my car and get a taxi home. So when you're working from home, some of those aspects don't take place. So I guess whilst, yes, a work balance works for me being at home, I guess those in government are probably thinking, how do we get the economy, refunctioning and generating that income? So I guess there's the personal balance versus the national balance that we need to consider. I think, how does someone, who doesn't feel like they have the influence to influence affect something? I think, if we look at all the great women that have done something, they're all rebels. And, if you're passionate about a cause, you will change it. And I think what the pandemic also taught us to do is to be very self-centered in our thinking. I think there was very much a culture which was work-driven, and that's all we ever knew. And the pandemic actually put a pause to some of that. And I think people have started thinking, hang on, how do I address some of this? And I appreciate some of it's policy driven. And, like I said previously, it's having the networks because sometimes one voice might not be enough, but a collection of voices can be enough to change it. So in our organization, for example, menopause, something not widely acknowledged, but actually, when you look at the research and the impact of women who are premenopausal or going through menopause, it's quite stark. But actually, make reasonable adjustments. Those women start to function very well. So for me, it's how are we, taking a different lens to this and starting to change the narrative because I think, we've only gone with what we've known, but actually, how can we change it to actually what we know is best?
Natasha, any thoughts from you on why we're seeing this and how people can challenge it? And also, I think you mentioned that you've done some tracking in your work to understand the impact on well-being and that type of thing. So what kind of things do you recommend to sort of say this does work? You've got some evidence.
Yeah, I absolutely think there's lots of data out there. If you look at the Gallup data, for example, Gallup has been tracking this for years now and has shown lots of different outcome metrics for well-being, for specific effects for women, specific effects for productivity. There's a lot of questions about, productivity. How do I make the case? There is data out there. There are also ways to track that data within your own environment and ask some of these questions and make that case over time. Another thing that I would just add of like, how can I, as a junior person or as a person who may have less power over, the larger policy or structure, I think it really starts at a local level. And by local here, I mean team. How do you think about it at your team? What are the things that are essential to do in person, if there are any? And what are the things that you can do just as well not in person, and start having that conversation with some team members and with your direct manager. What we've seen in a lot of environments is that is the way that like these things change, is that a team says, hey, we are going to pilot this way of working and try it out with our team for 3 months or 6 months or this amount of time and allow us to do that. Within the federal government, we have had to do things like that because, there are different kind of like notions about about working in office and not. And a lot of this is just starting as a pilot and saying, let's try this for our team. Let's show, some results and let's see how it goes either way, right? Like, let's actually test it out. It also gives us a chance to actually test it out and say, like, what are the things that were hard about it and what works. So I would really recommend, if you're like struggling and don't know where to start with your individual team, or if there's a team that is doing it, find out what they are doing. I think all of these things start in little pockets and then spread more widely. I think that's part of it. Why? I think another question that I saw in the chat is like, okay, if so many people think that this is helping with work-life balance and improving things, why are offices saying come back to the office? I think there's a few reasons. I think there is this misperception that if you are at home, you are like sitting there on your couch or like doing your laundry or like whatever, which like maybe you are for a few minutes a day. But probably most of the time, and there is data to support that, like most of the time you are actually working more when you are working at home. So that is a data point that you can use. I think also it's the mindset. So I think the mindset that we need for managers is to really value outcomes over time in office. And how do we move towards that measurement? I think a lot of times we measure a lot of proxies for outcomes, which include things like they spoke this many times in a meeting, or they attended X number of events. Great. What did that mean for how we delivered our service? What did that mean for how our clients feel about something? So really getting clear on the metrics too, and saying, can we actually measure some of these and see if there is any difference between doing that in work or in person? And I think part of why some organizations want people back in person is because they've paid for office space, frankly, and they want people to use that office space. But if we can say, sure, maybe there are times when we use that office space and maybe we use it really intentionally for a team building activity or for something else. But if we're actually being more productive at home, aren't we also making up for some of those cost investments in other ways? And I think, Kumbi, you said like, like happier employees also make more productive employees. We see the link between employee engagement. So this is another point that you can use. Higher engagement, which actually on-site employees, Gallup has done studies on this more recently, have lower engagement than both remote and hybrid employees. So actually saying that like employee engagement has a direct correlation to productivity. So showing some of those data points in different ways, and I'd say starting with your team and the local level and having some of those conversations are the first way to go.
Brilliant. Yadira, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I did want to point out, like reminding everyone how we got here, right? Big is a telework pilot in the interest of keeping all of us safe. And so now as we transitioned out of the pandemic, it's ended, we have started to increase our in-office presence at the SBA. We started off with everyone just coming back at least 2 days of pay period. And in January, it increased for non-supervisory employees, 4 days a pay period, which is 2 weeks for us. This year, we will be able to look at our engagement scores, as Natasha mentioned, to see how that change has impacted. When we first increased from fully offsite to 2 days a week, we saw an increase in our engagement. So we didn't notice any adverse effect from the organizational outcomes perspective. And we have also worked at the beginning at the program office level. So we set the agency policy around here's how often employees should be coming in. Then the program office level is really taking into consideration their culture and other expectations they might want to set in place to create meaningful engagement. So many of them have said, okay, we're all in on Tuesdays. And Tuesdays is really that day where we're having program office level meetings, we're having team meetings, and then the other day, perhaps that's the day the supervisor really leverages as opportunities to meet one-on-one with their employees. So then you get down to the local level, as Natasha mentioned, and that's really where you're going to see more of the impact, because these are the individuals you're working with, right, on a regular basis. And just from a mission perspective, we've always said we have a mission-based hybrid work model. Our customers, our stakeholders really drive when we're intended to be in the office. If we have a small business owner that's coming to one of our facilities, they should be greeted by an SBA employee. So we provide those real examples, especially for those positions that we know are more forward-facing, customer-facing. And like I mentioned before, we do have that exception to reporting to the official work site. It can be up to like a month. Because this is all complex, right? Then there's the pay thing that we have to worry about. So we can offer that flexibility if you have an emergency. Let's say you just had surgery, you can't be coming in the office, but you still are able to work from home. So it goes back to having that, communicating what those needs are with your supervisor and working with them to help identify what's going to work best. And I definitely agree with Natasha's perspective of framing this from like what's within my control. So what are those flexibilities available, that relationship with your supervisor, and advocating for yourself in terms of what you need at that point in time.
Brilliant. So we have got a few questions in that are probably maybe related to sort of culture type things. So someone's asking for constructive ways to, address colleagues that might joke about hybrid work arrangements being a way to slack off, and also related to that, how to balance morale across the different working models and ensure that people working remotely perhaps don't feel isolated and there's no impact on mental health. So any thoughts on kind of making the culture work cohesively so there isn't any sort of resentment and that type of thing? Natasha, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, so one of the things that has been helpful in my work environment is that one of our senior leaders actually like models the importance of hybrid work quite a bit. Works in a different place, has young children, often has them on calls, those types of things. And I think that opened up a lot of possibilities and permission for other people that may not be possible at every organization, but having people with some influence in the organization actually model some of those behaviors. I think it's really important when we think about like power structures in organization, people with more power in organizations actually making it more safe and more comfortable for other people to ask for things, to take certain risks, to do some of these things is really, really important. So I think from a cultural perspective, if there are more people showing that this is a thing that we do, especially people who have influence, it becomes more of a thing that we do. And I think it's also just like, I find that it's like really, I think it's hard to change culture because I think culture is like a very ingrained thing, but I think it's about day-to-day actions that happen. And so if you have a staff meeting, how do you talk about things in that staff meeting and have reminders to staff about why do we value hybrid work? We value hybrid work for these reasons. Sometimes we have people from our various employee resource groups actually talk about some of their own experiences, especially people who might lead a certain project. So we might have someone, for example, who is leading a project on formula shortage, who is also a parent and talks about their own experience and how they were sick for a week and someone else had to take that role from them. So like having some of the storytelling, like employee storytelling, I think is really helpful. Sometimes I hear people making some of those jokes and some of those comments because they haven't actually heard the stories behind why that might be the case. I think back for myself, maybe like 10 or 15 years ago before I had children, and I'd hear about people taking their kids in the middle of the day to baseball practice or different places. And I'd say, oh, wow, like they get to do that. Like that's, like I just thought it was so interesting because I hadn't really thought about that. So I think it's also like when you haven't had a specific experience, it's so helpful to hear someone's story on why and how they have that experience. And I think to like interrupt those things in a kind way, right? Like we talk about like bias interruption. So in a kind way, saying, hey, I get that it might seem like that, but actually, let me tell you my experience, right? Not saying, oh, you think that this is terrible and like you said a terrible thing, but just saying, hey, like, let me actually tell you about my experience with this and speaking as much as you can from your own experience. I think is really helpful. In my role as a DEIA director, I'm like always speaking from my own experience, but also knowing that I don't have all of the experiences. So inviting other people to speak to and saying, what was it like in your experience? And not assuming it was any one way or another, but really inviting, we talked about like neurodiversity. We have a neurodiversity employee group and inviting those people to a staff meeting and saying, what does remote work or flexible work mean for you? Like, what has it helped you do? And actually showcasing some of those stories. I think a lot of I think a lot of ways to like counteract like rules and regulations and like barriers are through storytelling and through saying like, here are some real examples of what this looks like. And I think culture is mostly about storytelling. Like, I think culture is mostly about like, what are the things that we talk about over and over and over again? They say like it takes like 7 times before someone hears a message. So like think about some of these big messages and think about like all the forums that you can share them and who are the people that could share them in different places. Sometimes it's really powerful to have someone with a direct lived experience share something. Sometimes it's really powerful to have a senior leader share something. Someone had also asked the question of like, are these benefits mostly targeted at women and like do men not know
Yes.
about these? I want to be very clear that like hybrid benefits everyone, not just women. And I think
Yes.
like the more we can make that case of like, yes, of course it benefits women, but it benefits men as well. It benefits people with disabilities as well. It benefits people of color as well, that it is really a benefit for everyone. And that sometimes, I have heard from parents who are men that said, I didn't know I had that option to go and pick up my kid from school, right? Like, it's not like I didn't want to do that. I just didn't know that was even an option. So I think it isn't really totally in our service to only like market certain things to certain populations and say that this is only for you, right? I think it's important to say this actually is really important for everyone. And here are some of the different ways that you might think about it.
Definitely, because I think someone was alluding in the comments the fact that could actually help to shift the balance on the caregiving responsibilities that you mentioned in your statistics, Natasha. Yadira or Kumbi, anything you'd like to add on the culture issue and how to keep that cohesive culture?
Definitely. I think it's highlighted that representation matters, and it's starting to help us to ask the question, who's, on our executive team, who sat around the board table, and actually, do we have the people with the right or the variety of lived experience? Because it takes someone walking in your shoes to understand the challenges that you face and to be in a position of power and authority to make those changes. So I think what Natasha rightly said, it's around that psychological safety. If your leadership are able to role model, to demonstrate that actually, this is okay, then will model that as well. And I think the thing for me as well around the, courageous conversations, one of the things that one of my mentors taught me was, to have a one-to-one with an individual, because sometimes trying to address, what wasn't rightly said in a public forum doesn't tend to go well because it tends to be a very defensive conversation. So, how are you taking that into a one-to-one space and actually saying to that individual, when you said this, do you know the impact that it had on me? And actually expressing how it made you feel, because sometimes people actually don't intend to have that impact, but there's intention and there's also impact. So again, it's raising that awareness, because sometimes it's not on our radar that that is the impact we're having. So I think that's important around isolation, particularly the impact on mental health. I think for us as a team, we've recognized that, and that's why we have our set in-person days, because we understand that people have different characters and personas, and people manage in different ways. So again, we have had new members in our team, and as a large organization, it's a struggle for a new person to understand how structures, systems, and functions work. And I think, was it Yadira who said, you come in and you say hi, and that turns into 30-minute, corridor conversation. And so it's quite relational. So I would say that whilst, yes, some companies are set up, to work in a remote hybrid, way, there's still a place for that in-person, I think, connection, because I think whilst technology has improved, there is something about the human psyche that says you still need that physical in-person contact. Again, when you're looking at our 5 senses, it's incredible how, over a Teams call or a Zoom call, you're not utilizing them all. And behavior models, I think about 70% is very much a visual way of communication. So are we losing some of that, through this? So for me, it's readdressing some of those balances. But I'll also say, for example, if I'm on Teams meetings all day and you get me to commute for 1 hour just to be in Teams meetings all day in the office, I'm not sure I'm going to be thankful, that I'm in that, situation. So again, how are we being practical and saying, okay, Kumbi's got Teams meetings all day. Actually, it's okay for her to work at home that day, but actually we've got this new project and we want to do some blue sky thinking. Actually, Kumbi, can you come into the office for the day? Because I think we'll generate better ideas, as research has shown, so yes, I think it's finding a balance. I appreciate, we've still got a way to go to improve it, but I think it's looking at your situation, your context, looking at your policies, and I think it's having conversations because I think, I've said to teams I've managed before, unless you tell me there's an issue, I can't read your mind. And, I hope I'm flexible in my approach once I know, what the, issue is to try and bring a solution to it. So I think for me, I think it's, yeah, highlighting if there are any things that aren't working because your managers might not necessarily be aware that, you're being impacted in the way that you are.
Brilliant. So we just have a few minutes left now. So to close it, I think it'd be a good way to round it off. Someone's asked about if you don't have a policy in place at the moment, how would you encourage someone who wants to drive that to go about it? So you do. Would you like to give us your views on how they can, just a few bullets on how they can get that going?
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely recommend connecting. I'm in human resources. So even if you first get that champion from your supervisor, another executive who is modeling the behavior, clearly articulates the benefits of working with them to champion the effort, and then connecting with your human resources department, because they really would be the one at leading this policy development process for you all. And the Global Government Forum is a great place to start and getting to connect with what other nations are doing. Sharing the research that Natasha has shared is key to building that business case, especially if you can pull in like those specific metrics for your own organization. I think would be really powerful to at least be prepared to have that conversation. But the policy development, like you all know, it's complex.
Yeah.
HR can lead it, but then we also have labor unions we have to be mindful of and work with. And then there's senior leadership. So that's a good place to start.
Brilliant. Thank you. Kumbi, any points you'd add to that about getting a policy off the ground?
I think Yadira is correct in saying, work closely with HR. They are your starting point. I think also use social media, use things like X, formerly Twitter, LinkedIn, because there are a lot of groups out there, forums who, as one of my managers said, work smarter, not harder. If someone has learned the trials and errors of creating it, utilize that, adapt and adopt, what's already out there in your organizations. So I think it's very much, yes, coming forward because sometimes we assume people know, and actually your HR might be saying, thank you very much. We actually hadn't considered that. How do we work in partnership and collaboration with you? And sometimes, yes, you need the voice of the union because sometimes you need that independent, objective voice that comes in and says, these are some of the policies, these are some of the protected characteristics we need to ensure are not being negatively or adversely affected when we implement these policies.
Thank you. And Natasha?
Yeah, I think all of those steps are absolutely right. And I think it's just about how I was talking about the storytelling also that goes with all of the data and finding the advocates. If you can also talk to some specific groups, if you have employee resource groups, for example, those are a great place to start just kind of building the story collection of like, how does this affect my work? Saying, here are the data points, here's how it relates to a real person in our organization, connecting those places. I'd also say with building the case and building on like what's already been done, sometimes there are other organizations that you partner with or that a senior leader in your organization respects. And if they have done it, finding people at those organizations and saying, could you come just like for a presentation to like tell us a little bit and share some lessons learned for a brainstorming session, like make it kind of informal of like an information exchange. I think sometimes it is hard to be the first person doing something or to go into a new space, or you just don't really know how it's been done. If we can share more ways that it's being done at other places that you respect or you work with, I think it makes it much more doable for your organization as well.
Brilliant. So I want to thank the speakers for sharing your experience from your organisation and also your personal insights and some practical ideas on this important topic. And thank you to the attendees who've sent in your questions. After the event, we will send around a recording and we'll publish a summary of the discussion on our website. And if there are any questions that we haven't got to, we'll try to follow them up after the webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, again. It's been really valuable to have your input.